Well, I gotta be honest with you. Originally, I was gonna do this big old setup where I was gonna be talking about the game that was my game of the year in vague terms and kind of let you guys build up to the reality and the situation of what it is, but I realized that it wasn't really worth it for what is effectively a cheap gag, and on top of that, it would make things weird in future archives if they go back and see a video entitled Best Game of 2014, Rumination, and they're like, well, what the hell's that, you know? Rather than that, I decided I'd just be open and honest with you guys. Now, I have no doubt that there are people who are going to look at this and say, oh, this is your favorite game of 2014? Pwah, what a surprise. Archie guy, like it's an old-style nostalgia fest, you know. That kind of a thing is kind of to be expected under the circumstances. And if you think that that's entirely your opinion, and you are entitled to that, of course. But as I've kind of started the trend all the way back in Chrono Trigger, I don't really feel like saying Shovel Knight is an amazing game is acceptable. What I want to do instead is explain why I think it is that it is an amazing game. And I'm going to start with something kind of weird. So what I want to talk to you about briefly here is a concept of marketing, alright? Now see, here's the thing. Some of you may or may not be aware of the fact that I actually know a decent amount about business and marketing. I've talked about this before. I even went to school for several such things way back in the long ago, in the before times. As I was back there, one of the things that really occurred to me that not a lot of businesses were doing at the time was the concept of niche marketing. Now, here's the thing, and I've talked about this before on my streams, so I'm going to kind of speak of this in a truncated fashion to, you know, try not to distract from those who've already heard this stuff. Niche marketing is entirely centered around the concept of aiming for a specific niche, and then really tailoring your product, whatever that happens to be, to that niche, to what is generally believed to be considered enjoyable about that niche. Now, for those of you who aren't really getting the point here, RPGs are not a niche. Tactical RPGs aren't even a niche. Tile-focused, or tile-structured, turn-based tactical RPGs, that's a niche, okay? To explain what I mean, you gotta go down several layers in order to really get to what I'm talking about here. So, when you get down to that kind of a thing, you really got to be thinking about what you want to do, how you want to do it, etc., right? I mean, this is just common sense when you come down to it. But what I'm trying to say is that what tends to happen in gaming, especially in the modern era of communication, is now more than ever before we actually have the availability of actually going and appealing to these markets, because you know, in previous times, getting a hold of these markets, getting a hold of the people who actually want this specific niche of game was much more difficult to do. One of the reasons we had niche games in the NES era and the SNES era at all was mainly because we had so much of a boon as far as development. We had so many people developing games that it just kind of happened naturally. People wanted to make Game A. It's another one of the reasons why there's so many hidden treasures amongst the silver and golden ages of gaming, because so many people didn't really discover those games until the modern age, the communication age, in order to discover them. But I'm getting off the point. The reason I'm in favor of niche marketing is very simple. Statistically speaking, and this is a generalization, this is not an absolute, okay, but statistically speaking, when you produce a game and really focus tightly on one specific market, you are more likely to come across and get a game that is actually good, you know, superior, basically, rather than trying to stretch your resources thin. This is especially true in the last couple of years when the indie market has really taken off, because when you're playing an indie game, or when you're making an indie game, excuse me, oftentimes your development team is kind of small. And so if you have this tiny little development team, it's an interesting thing, because money becomes much less of an issue as so much as time, and actually having and allocating the time budget for an indie team becomes a huge problem that needs to be overcome. Which leads me, of course, to the idea of, you know, trying to focus all of your effort on something specific, right? Now, the reason this tends to work, and the reason Shovel Knight exploded so well, is basically because of this in a nutshell. Would you stop that? Hey! The idea here being that Shovel Knight was very specifically aiming for a very Mega Man style side-scrolling puzzle action platformer, okay? With customization options. That's another thing. It's kind of hard to really explain that in a nutshell, but I'll talk more about what I mean by that in a bit here. The point is, they aimed for that niche, they focused on it hard, they got the Kickstarter backing, tons of Kickstarter backing, they produced this game, and they really put their heart into it. They really worked to create this amazing game. Here's the thing, the game is fundamentally good. I'm sorry, it is it's the kind of game that you can look at, and you may not like it personally, and there are plenty of people who do not like this personally. There are plenty of people who have fallen victim to the pendulum theory here, aka I'm tired of hearing about how great this game is, so I'm just going to bash it just because I'm tired of the positivity, the excessive positivity. But overall, this is a fundamentally good game because a lot of the things they did were really top-notch, and I'll be talking about those in the future. This led to a strong consumer base which said, yes, this game is awesome, which leads me to arguably the single most important thing, period, when it comes to marketing any video game. This is true in most entertainment industries in general, but video games especially. If you're going to do that, if you're going to market a game, having a loyal consumer base which will, on their own, spread word of your game, that's the best marketing you could have. Word of mouth has always been superior marketing. This has been true for forever, and this is especially true in the communications era. But the availability to more or less instantly have however many 100 or 1,000 people saying your game is amazing is why Shovel Knight exploded the way it did, because so many people liked it of that niche market and said this is amazing, which kind of leads me to my next point. The other thing they did, and this is related to difficulty, I'll be talking about this a little bit more later, is they made this game what I like to call a gateway game. Now, to explain what I mean a little bit, when you're making a niche game especially, in general you want to focus on everything that niche wants, but one of the problems that a lot of indie developers, and AAA developers as well, have made in this regard is they'll make it completely inaccessible. They will make a game that is awesome for their market, but only for people who are already in that market. AKA, you're not getting any new consumers, you're not getting any new customers, because they can't get into your game. The barrier to entry is simply too difficult. Make sense? A gateway game is a game that is still based on that niche, still focused on it, but the barrier to entry is virtually non-existent, or at the very least much, much lower. Shovel Knight is pretty much a very typical archetype of this concept. The first few stages of Shovel Knight are very, very easy, very simple. The way they tutorialize, which I'll be talking about more later, is fundamentally awesome. The controls take you no time at all to get used to, etc., etc. You can customize the hell out of your controls too. I was playing with my SNES controller, of course. There's plenty of different options with there, etc., etc. And the point is, if I was to recommend this game to someone else who is not hugely into side-scroller platformers of the upgrade variety, this game might sell them on that, because it's a game they can get into and don't have to already be pre-invested and really good at. You see where I'm going with this? In further note, Shovel Knight does two huge things. I'm going to go and mention these now because I don't really have a good spot to mention them. Number one, it has New Game Plus. I've talked about this a few hundred quadrillion times. New Game Plus is something that virtually every game should have, and therefore it is awesome that this one has New Game Plus. Second thing it does is fascinating. There are cheats in Shovel Knight. Now, I mention this as a good thing. There are developer-made, pre-built-in cheats, and there's some big ones, Super Mega Jump Mode, I think, was one, and there was one that was called just God Mode. I don't actually know what it involves, but it probably is exactly what it sounds like, etc., right? The reason I mention that as a good thing is very simple. There are plenty of games that some people like to enjoy but don't want to actually invest the time and the practice in getting good at. Now, I've heard plenty of elitist remarks about how, those people just need to man up or whatever, or woman up, as the case may be. I obviously don't agree with those at all. My most famous example of this is, of course, the original 3 Warcraft games. I know 2 people, right off the top of my head, personally, people I know in person, who love those games and have never played them without cheats because they aren't good at RTSs, but they enjoy the gameplay style enough to actually play the game and not just watch it on YouTube, and they really get into the story of it and the theme and the music and all that fun stuff. So they get to enjoy the Warcrafts because cheats were built in. Again, this is adding another consumer to your market, adding another loyal customer. So another really excellent decision made on behalf of Yacht Games here. Now, let's see, there was one other thing I wanted to mention before we get into the big thing. Let's go ahead and discuss... Let's go ahead and talk about the difficulty problem right now. Here's the thing. I've noticed, and I am culpable in this as well, that most people tend to assume difficulty means frustration. Now, to explain what I mean by that, I'm not just talking about developers. Most people, when they think, what's the hardest game you've played? What's the hardest boss you've fought? That kind of a thing. They tend to think about the one that took them the longest time, or the one that frustrated the most, or both, as the case may be. That's not difficulty. I mean, I hate to say that, but it isn't. That is not difficulty. The idea here is difficulty is something that requires significant effort, practice, etc. to overcome, not something that relies on any of the many artificial difficulty things I've talked about, and frustration mechanics are a huge part of that. I've talked about that extensively before. Now, the reason I bring this up is one of the biggest complaints I hear about Shovel Knight is it's too easy. I found that odd, because I found this game pretty much to be perfectly challenging, especially on New Game Plus mode, where everything hits harder. and there's a few other things done, fewer checkpoints, that kind of a thing. But in general, pretty much hit a perfect balance of difficulty for me, and I thought about it for a long time, and I kind of came to the conclusion of why that is. I'm going to use Mega Man 2 as a direct example of what I'm talking about. Quick Man Stage, for those of you who've ever played that game. If you haven't, what are you doing watching? Go play Mega Man 2. Go play Quick Man Stage right now. Oh, wait. Watch this dance going on over here. Okay, you done? Quick Man Stage is a stage that it is possible to get through based purely on reflexes and agility of playing the controls. But that is unlikely, and is only really going to happen if you're already really good at that type of game, which most people who play that game, to be perfectly honest, are not. Including me, by the way. I don't think I'm talking down to anyone. I am not actually that great of a gamer, as anyone who's watched my stream can tell you. By the way, this actually is me playing back here. This is my own gameplay, so if you see me die 50 times, that's why. So as you're playing through Mega Man 2, the only really viable way for most gamers to get through Quick Man Stage is to memorize the beams. Now that's actually not really good game design. Not really when you come down to it. Practice is one thing. Requiring memorization on a literal binary pass-fail, that's different. See, any game that relies on one of those kind of artificial cheats like that is a game that I hesitate to call properly difficult. Now, I'm not going to say Mega Man 2 is artificially difficult, because there's lots of genuine difficulty in Mega Man 2 as well. There's a reason Mega Man 2 basically started the genre of game that you're seeing played right here. Yes, Mega Man 2 did that, by the way, not Mega Man 1. Mega Man 2 popular. It's the Doom thing all over again. Doom, Wolfenstein, Tank, Berserker, whatever. Point being, this kind of gameplay, if Shovel Knight in no point in time ever reached a point where I actually felt it was being cheap or using artificial difficulty. The health of the bosses was decently possible to get through. It was no padding as far as that. There were no gotcha traps that I encountered. There were no circumstances in which I had to memorize a stage in order to get through it. There's very few binary pass-fail things. There was no RNG as far as success goes. Every aspect of difficulty I felt in this game was genuine difficulty, good difficulty, which is awesome. And it's just why I look at people, what are you doing? Which is why I look at people weird when they say that Shovel Knight is too easy, because, again, I'm a terrible gamer, but I found Shovel Knight properly challenging, but enjoyably challenging. One of the things that I tend to talk about a lot is the ineffable qualities of games, the things that can't be defined or laid out, or you write down in exactly what parameters what it is. You can't quantify certain things, in my opinion. One of those things is the frustration factor. Now, some things can basically always be said to frustrate. That's just that. But a game like this should theoretically frustrate me. I mean, I died quite a few times, especially on the tower stage, the first one. But I never got frustrated. At no point in time did I put the controller down and want to leave it down. And I think the best way to describe that is to really go over all the things that Shovel Knight did right, in addition to the things I've already talked about. You see, what Shovel Knight did correctly is, I'm going to go down the list here, okay? But the first thing I want to talk about is the controls. There's very few things that can make or break any side-scrolling platformer, hell, any platformer in general, side-scrolling, three-dimensional, puzzle platform, action platform, doesn't matter, than bad controls. I know at least some of you out there have played games that otherwise would be good, except they were ruined by bad controls. I can name one right off the top of my head. Mega Man 3, even though it is an amazing game in virtually every respect, has some flaws with the way the slide mechanic works, and if you've played the game, you know what I'm talking about. And that is a control issue. It is a bad control issue. There are plenty of other games that have design flaws when it comes to controls, like input lag or not being able to punch the buttons at the right times. Actually, the original Metroid, believe it or not, falls into this category. The point being, having smooth controls that respond more or less immediately to what you're doing and what you want to do, and are, you hit this button, it happens, you're able to cancel out your animations, you're able to do all these things. I've talked about all this kind of thing when it comes to controlling UI before, with regards to Kingdom Hearts series specifically. Good control scheme can make or break a game like this, and this game felt very precise and very capable of responding to my input. I don't actually know if Shovel Knight is a 60 FPS game, but I know it is at very least a 30 FPS game. And the reason that is significant is because that affects controls as well. You can either input the amount of basically, in most 60 FPS games, you can input every other frame, which means basically 30 inputs per second. The same is true for most 30 FPS games, but it's still every other frame, which means 15 inputs per second. Now that may not sound like it makes a lot of difference, but when you're playing, and you're really in the zone, it may not happen that often, but I assure you, if you're really into it, you will notice when you should have been able to hit something there, but you couldn't because it was only accepting 15 inputs per second, and you happen to be on one of those off sectors. See where I'm going with this? Let's talk about the graphics. I'm giving a nice example of the graphics. We'll be continuing to do that for a few minutes here in the background. Experimenting. This took forever to set up, by the way. Don't expect this all the time. The graphics of this game, in my opinion, are phenomenal, and I mean that sincerely. They are obviously, 8-bit, pixelated, whatever you want to call that graphics, but the reason I bring this up is one of the things I've said a few trillion times is that creativity is often best served by limitation. One of the reasons why so much of the old 8-bit, and especially the 16-bit games, have graphics that have aged very well, in most people's opinions, because it's always an opinion thing, is because the creators and developers involved were very limited in what they could do, and therefore had to be creative and had to think about what they were doing, right? When it comes to this game, they were not limited at all, not really. However, they did, well, okay, I'm saying that wrong. They weren't limited in terms of the engine and the hardware, which is actually the next point I'm going to make here. But they were limited to 8-bit. They had to use pixel art, and so they had to get creative with that. And as I showed earlier in the town section as well, there's a great deal of attention to detail and attention to finesse and trying to flesh out this world. I mean, you could see, like, okay, here, look, you see these, there's like little globes on these things, there's like a little feather right there, and there's this nice little shining on the upper part of that platform that we just passed, lots and lots and lots of little details, and at no point in time did I look at something and wonder, well, what is that? That's always the good example of, to put it bluntly, bad pixel art, is when you look at something and you're like, well, what the hell is that? And there is a lot of bad pixel art, both in indie retro games and the old 8-bit and 16-bit eras, so I like the graphics design. Very, very colorful, very varied. Huge amount of variances. And, okay, I'm going to go and lead into the next thing. I like this game for many of the same reasons why I like Mega Man 9 and Mega Man 10. I actually had what at the time I thought was a pipe dream. Make a Nintendo game, an NES game, or an SNES game, but I was thinking NES specifically. Make an NES game, but do it with modern hardware. None of the limitations, none of the screen capture issues, none of the layer issues, none of the palette issues. Just make a game of that style with all the modern technology to back it. And then Mega Man 9 came out, and I was like, oh my god. And, Shovel Knight here is probably one of the examples of this kind of concept, because they used tons of things that basically wouldn't have worked on the NES or the SNES, or, well, maybe the SNES. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I can give you a very simple example. I'm not going to show you here, because this took forever to set up. Look at Mario Bros. 3 on the NES, one time. In just about any case where there's a significant amount of anything on the screen, and it doesn't have to be that much, you'll see clipping issues. Stuff will kind of halfway go on the screen and off the screen, and there's this like line on the lower right that's like, because it's trying to draw and render it away, because that was a limitation of what the NES could do. We don't have that limitation anymore. So trying to make a game of that style, but with those same graphics. Okay, let me give you an example. You see over there, you see that little bit of fog that's going in the background? And one of the other things, I can't show you immediately, but it's present in a lot of areas, is they have multiple layers just in the background to really help flesh the background out. This kind of goes back to that good graphics design thing. So they really use the modern technology to its fullest in order to actually render a game that looks like an 8-bit game, but basically isn't. and I'm kind of leading to a point overall with all of this. I'll get there, trust me. Speaking of which, this is a great time to talk about animation. I don't have much to say about animation other than the fact that animation, in my professional and personal opinion, is actually more important than graphics. If you have a game that looks graphically kind of but is beautifully animated, in my opinion, that game looks better than a game that is very, very well designed and poorly animated. I can actually give you a direct example of this. In my personal opinion, World of Warcraft looks better than Lord of the Rings Online, even though, at least at one point in time, Lord of the Rings Online fundamentally had better graphics. It was just animated worse. You see where I'm going with this? This is the same thing with a lot of SNES games in general, why I feel a lot of SNES games have aged so well. Link to the Past, Mega Man X, and hell, the whole Mega Man series, Mega Man X series in general. But another way to explain what I'm talking about here is what I like to call the Final Fantasy Tactics effect. Okay, for those of you who have not played FFT, well, I don't blame you, because that's definitely a niche game. But Final Fantasy Tactics had a thing where it was sprite-based, but it was on a PlayStation. It was a PlayStation 1 game, right? So they reached a point where they could actually do more than have 3 frames of animation per character, okay? What they did was they went completely overboard with this and had close to 10 or 12 animations for everything that happened. The result was it looked very smooth. It looked really good, seeing this character, you know, go like this, instead of, or from the SNES era, you know, that kind of a thing. Shovel Knight, in general, doesn't go to the FFT extreme, but it definitely has a large amount of frames per animation, and that works very well for it. The average, I noticed, is about 3 frames of animation per thing, and that's usually at a minimum. I have seen several things that had closer to 6 or 7, which really makes it look smoother. It makes it flow better, and again, has better animation. Sound design is top-notch for this game. Really, really. Sound design is one of those hidden things that a lot of games... Hell, this is true in games, movies, and television as well. Sound designers don't get the credit they really need. Most people don't even understand how much sound design affects their enjoyment of a thing. To use a very simple example, if you've ever seen Star Wars A New Hope, okay? I'm pretty sure it's still on YouTube. You can find... I actually had this on a VHS thing from a TV. You can find a copy of the awards ceremony scene, raw footage. In other words, how it actually looked when they were filming it. No sound design, no music overlaid, just a bunch of people, some people coughing awkwardly in the background. It lacked any of the feeling or emotion of the actual scene. The only thing that changed was the sound design. Now, I know to some of you this is going to sound like I'm saying, duh, but I want to re-stress this because sound design is incredibly important to gaming. Good sound design can make or break a game, in my honest opinion, in a same, if not more so, effect than animation can. So, Shovel Knight is great with its sound design. It has lots of audio cues and indicators of what's going on and how things happened. There's this wonderful little thing, there's this ability, I can't even remember what's used, but it makes you invincible for like 3 seconds. But it actually has a sound note for when you hit it, a sound note that plays while it's active, and a sound note that plays while it's about to kill, and then a sound note that plays immediately after it when it's run out. That's a great example in action of good sound design, and knowing exactly what's happening at a given point in time because the sounds are telling you, right? That also is another way the new hardware is helpful, by the way. Most NES games, hell, all NES and SNES games were limited to a few, relatively small number of channels that they could actually work from. So having basically no real functional limitation on how many channels they could use other than how much they wanted to use really helped them to be able to do a lot of things with having multiple sounds playing at the same time, which is something NES and SNES games have a problem doing. Good example of this, Secret of Mana. If you've ever played that, at certain points in time, the music kind of cuts out a bit because some of the music is playing on channels that are being used by the sound. Don't have that problem here. I suppose this is a good time to talk about the music. The music's incredible. In my opinion, the music of Shovel Knight is a great example of what I was talking about earlier, using your limitations to great effect. Granted, I tend to like digitized synth music in general, more commonly referred to as 8 and 16-bit music. And this is definitely an 8-bit soundtrack, which of course fits the overall theme and style of the game. But even if this was a soundtrack that was playing for a more modern, HD, polished, super amazing game that costs $60 and has terrible gameplay, I would still enjoy it a great deal. Yeah, this thing, this thing, this is the invincible thing I was talking about earlier. Anyways, because the music itself is very well designed. There's lots of excellent usages of melody and harmony. There's a lot of thematic significance that they use in the tunes, and there's a lot of leitmotif, which I'm still probably pronouncing incorrectly, which is used all over the place in order to emphasize certain types of scenes, or certain events, or certain characters, you know, blah, blah, blah. Really, really good stuff on the music. I apologize for not having more to say on the music, other than it's amazing. But one thing I do want to say about the music is actually two things, I should say. First of all, the soundtrack is available online. I recommend you go grab it. Second thing, though, the composer who did this, he's not done a lot of things, but everything he's done has been good, in my opinion. And composers, I should say. There's two, really. And I mention this because I think I could summarize everything about why Shovel Knight is amazing. All these points I've been going down the list on, by saying that it's obvious these people cared about making a good game. I know I get flack every time I say this. There's always one person who is either literally or ironically saying this, but I make money doing these videos. It is my living. And that's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with making money at something you like doing. There really isn't. Depending on what the thing you like doing is, of course. But the reason I bring this up is because the money is never the focus. The money is an unfortunate reality that I have to deal with so I can deal with bills and taking care of, you know, the little one and my sister and all that fun stuff, right? And being able to buy games to enjoy my existence. But I mention this because I did something for money is something that I hear a lot when it comes to gaming design. That, you know, oh, well, that game was just made to make money. That comment is, in my opinion, very dismissive, specifically because of the fact that it is implying, if not literally outright saying, that the only thing that developer cared about was their paycheck. Now, there are cases where this is true. I actually often refer to this as another form of the Voyager effect, aka, this is just another day job for me, not something I really care about. But, and again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But statistically speaking, something that people really, really cared about pushing out there, something that they were passionate about, something they wanted to be a good game. They wanted, well, I'm going to go and use George Lucas as an example here. They wanted to add to something that they loved. They are geeks themselves, or people who are very interested in programming and design, and really wanted to toss their contribution to history, to culture, to society. And they wanted people to enjoy their game, or book, or movie, or whatever. This applies in just about any form of entertainment. I mention this when it comes to the music specific, because I've read several interviews of the guy, and it's pretty obvious that he, along with most of the staff involved, really, really cared about making a good game, and really put their heart and soul into it. And again, the music shines with that. It's kind of funny because you can't tell this, of course, because I'm going to actually overlay music over this video. But watching the game right now, for record keeping and whatnot, as I've got this thing playing here, without the sound, without the music, it is actually kind of taking a little bit away from it, as per I just mentioned. But I digress. Let's go ahead and talk about one more thing here before we get to the big thing. Two big things, actually. Well, we'll do this thing first. The money system, in my opinion, was a great design choice for Shovel Knight. It's an upgrade system. I mentioned that that's the thing that Mega Man 2 basically got popularized. The idea is, rather than having RPG elements, you have different abilities you can use at certain times, and different ways to basically improve yourself in small manners. It's a fine difference between what other things use. Like, for example, Symphony of the Night had elements of this, but it was more RPG focused due to the fact that you actually had levels, stats, etc. By contrast, though, several Metroid games have this same kind of upgrade mechanic, to the point where you basically are supposed to get stronger as you go on. And of course, I've already mentioned the Mega Mans. The point I bring up through this, though, is using the money as a way to do this was a brilliant design choice for two big reasons. Number one, it made the player actually care about going out and getting those coins. Most players who play Mario games don't really have to be convinced to get coins, because it's just kind of a thing you do, you know? But when you really think about it, for the most part, those coins are not actually useful in just about any case. By contrast, getting all the gold in this game directly relates to getting upgrades and whatnot, and being able to actually get some of the things that make certain elements of the game possible. I mean, I'm pretty sure there's no point in the game, the main story, that you actually had to have an upgrade for. But I know for a fact that a lot of the optional areas you absolutely had to have the face thing, or the dash flying dagger thing, which I'll probably show off soon, or the fist thing that I've got equipped right now. That way, excuse me. You know, all that sort of stuff, right? That's a good system too, because it ties in beautifully with something I've talked about a lot when it comes to game design. For those of you who don't really get this, allow me to elaborate in brief. Any game has to have consequence. There has to be penalty for failure. Otherwise, the game is just going to fall flat on its face, and people are just going to not be invested and not enjoy it. With some exceptions, of course. There are exceptions to everything. I don't feel like I need to mention that. But penalty for failure is in my opinion, one of the most difficult things to get across properly in game design, because what you want is that sweet spot. I've talked about this before. If you're too penalizing, you get into frustration range. You get into the point where you're just being punishing rather than, you know, trying to encourage the player to keep playing or keep trying, whatever. And again, if you go too light, the player's just going to feel uninvested, or they're going to feel like it's too easy, or they're going to feel like they're being, you know, coddled to or whatever, and they're not going to feel like they're being engaged by the game, right? So you got to get this sweet spot in between these two. Shovel Knight has a beautiful idea and an example of that sweet spot, because you lose money when you die. Now, there's no lives. In fact, I'm not even sure if it's possible to game over in this game. I've never encountered that personally, but you lose money. It's up there. I've got like 4,000 right now, right? Now, I need that gold to buy upgrades and stuff and whatnot. Well, I shouldn't say I need, because I'll get to that in a moment. But the point is, I lose bags of money when I die. Now, in virtually all cases, when I go back through the stage from whatever checkpoint I just died at, or died after, I can go and reclaim that money. And there's actually tools and abilities to go and reclaim all the little bits of money if they fall in unusual places, which is good design as well, by the way. But I mentioned the other thing. See, here's the thing. You don't actually need money. And that's why I feel it hits the sweet spot, because there is an investment reason. There is definite purpose in the money. You can upgrade, and you get new abilities and new cool stuff and things that make the game smoother or funner, or just have a general cool factor to them and enjoyment factor to them. But they're optional. You don't really need that money if you really don't care, or if you're doing a no items run, you can just go through and not bother. And so then you could just play without. But that is a choice on your behalf, not the game's. The game is not forcing you into too easy or too hard mode. You see? It also makes it nice, because even if you do care about the money, it means you don't necessarily have to put it simply, you don't have to get back every death. If you get to a point where you've got that money thing there, and you can make the choice of your own volition to say, I don't feel like going and getting those bags of money that are floating over some abyss that are incredibly hard to reach, because I can afford to lose that, because the money is ultimately optional. Now again, you know, most players are going to want large chunks of money, especially since it costs a ton of cash in order to get all the upgrades. But that is still my point. It is optional, and I think it hits that sweet spot pretty much beautifully. Let's talk about the last thing I want to talk about before I lead up to my big point. You notice we're basically talking about gameplay. Of course we are. We're talking about Shovel Knight. I will be talking about story later. Big point. Level design. Level design, more than anything else, will make or break just about any platformer game. Level design is why Yoshi's Island is still considered to this day to be one of the greatest games of the side-scrolling platforming genre. Level design is one of the reasons why Donkey Kong Country Returns, despite having dodgy control issues and a few other difficulty complications with it, is still considered a classic and an amazing game that is highly recommended by many people, myself included. Level design is the meat of any game of this variety. Make no mistake. You know, everything else can contribute. As I said, sound, controls, animation, graphics, music, all of that contributes. But level design is what really makes or breaks it. Now, level design is kind of a vague term, and is actually harder to define than it sounds. I'm actually glad I'm talking about this here, because this is one of my favorite levels that's playing right here in the background. The Clockwork Tower. This is great level design in a nutshell. Now, it's hard to talk about level design without really getting into the nitty-gritty and, frankly, the boring. But it really boils down to a couple things. I'm just going to summarize for you rather than going into full detail, okay? Number one, it has to be self-tutorialized. If you need something, if you have something going on that's contradictory or whatnot, and this is not a game designed to be that type of game, see, I Want to Be the Guy, for example, this, then Yeah, no, you failed at level design. If you start doing that sort of contradictory or unexpected type of thing, basically just to be a dick, just to kill the player, that is really artificial difficulty. In a nutshell, it's one of the prime examples thereof. If, however, you tutorialize within the level, so you know, for example, you encounter a mechanic and the player is allowed to see how it happens and how it functions, so that later on they can then expand on that idea. It's imagine it like a branching path of learning, for lack of a better way to put it. You know, as you go through, you learn that this does this and this does this, and so when you get to the next step, you can find they interact with this way because that's logical, because you saw how they interacted separately. And then when you get to the next step, you can see how those two things interact with this, and so forth and so on, and it just builds upon itself. That's pretty much the 101 fundamental level design right there. And the second thing that really, this is the second point, like I said, I'm going to summarize, that really helps level design is innovation and creativity, inventiveness, fun factor. The most difficult level in the world may or may not be particularly fun to play, but if you make a level that is rather easy, yet nevertheless is a ton of fun to play through, people are going to remember that. People are going to remember, oh, I remember the level where you get to hop on the spiral things, or I remember the level where you have to go dashing through this area and you have to hit the buttons in just the right order, you know. If it has that kind of cool, fun, innovative factor of coolness, people are going to remember it more. To use an example of this is admittedly boss design, not level design, but the principle is exactly the same. Raphael the Raven, Yoshi's Island. People remember that boss to this day as being one of the most innovative bosses in, you know, side-scrolling history, but most especially of the SNES era. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just look it up sometime on YouTube. The video will explain better than I can. Just look it up. Raphael the Raven, Yoshi's Island. You'll see what I mean. That innovative, fun, cool factor was just all over that boss. It's a stupidly easy boss, but that's not what people remember. Similarly, Shovel Knight has this all over the place. Tons of neat little mechanics and interesting little ways that things unfold and develop on themselves, so that at no point in time did I ever get bored of any given stage. I never felt like there was ever any point in time at which the various stages, and there are quite a few, and the stages are quite long, I might add, that I actually got dulled of them. I was just like, oh god, am I done with this place yet? No, I never got to that. And each stage also kind of builds on its own theme. Like, we're going through an ice stage here, so of course there's ice mechanics, and there's a water stage, which of course has water mechanics. But that's not the only thing that defines those stages. For example, right now I'm dropping snow strategically on ice spikes so I don't instantly die, so that means I have to actually jump through here pretty carefully. I died here like 5 or 6 times because I was impatient, basically, and I was trying to push through, and wasn't giving the snow time to land in time. Little touches like that really help add to replay value as well. But even if they don't add to replay value, they make it fun the first time around, and they make it memorable the first time around. Let's go ahead and talk about the... One more thing. I already talked about difficulty. Let's talk about speedrunning. I know this is going to sound weird, but this is one of a very, very few number of games, in fact I can only think of 3 right off the top of my head, that were designed by the developers with speedrunning in mind, that they actually deliberately wanted players to speedrun this and coded the game accordingly. This game actually has a lot of speedrunning convenience features and its own built-in timers and death counters and all that fun stuff, and in general they actually did a patch to change certain things that were punishing to speedrunners somewhat recently, specifically to cater to that audience. I don't have much to add here. It's just a very unusual thing to see, but given the market, again, that niche market, side-scrolling upgrade platformer, yeah, it makes a lot of sense that you would cater to speedrunners in specific, because speedrunning those kind of games is incredibly popular. There's a reason why Metroids and Mega Mans are the 2 most speedrun types of games that exist, with a close third being FPS games, because Quake and all that fun stuff. So, all of this has been building to a point. I've been trying to discuss why I think this game is amazing, and you'll notice I've talked about nothing but gameplay, and that's by design. There is one other thing I want to talk about gameplay-wise, and that's the fact that, I'm just going to say it bluntly, this is the nostalgia discussion, okay? There's no getting around this. Nostalgia is a part of what we do and what we enjoy. There's no denying that. There is no arguing it, and to be perfectly blunt, there's no real shame in it either. If I enjoy Mega Man 2 because it reminds me of a better time and I remember my good times I had when I was a kid, then that means I enjoy Mega Man 2. That's the important part. Now, I personally have always been fascinated about the concept of the then and now. That's why I started that whole series, which hopefully I'll be continuing someday, of the then and now, in order to examine which games have aged well and why, because there are certain games of that era that I can't go back and enjoy anymore. PC, NES, SNES, doesn't matter. And then there are ones that I go back and I still enjoy because they're still good games despite the nostalgia factor. You see the difference here. Now, I mention this because a lot of people have said that a lot of indie games in the modern era are basically just artificially reaching for nostalgia factor in order to sell. And that is absolutely true. I do not think Shovel Knight is in that list. And I kind of have already explained why, if you've been paying attention. Shovel Knight, regardless of nostalgia factor, which it does have, is still a fundamentally good game. If you took away the 8-bit graphics, took away the 8-bit music, made this a modern platform, even made it in 3D with the same level design, I know that'd be a nightmare, but just bear with me here, it would still be a fundamentally good game because it was a good game at its core. All those things I was talking about were all good game design, not good 8-bit game design. The reason Shovel Knight is such an amazing game is not because it is some nostalgic fest of, oh, the good old silver age of gaming. It's a good game because it's a good game. It lives and dies on its own merits. I also have something to add to that. I know one person, personally, who never got into this era of gaming, who played this game and loved the hell out of it. I'm not going to give names. But I mention this because he himself and I had a big discussion about nostalgia factor, aka, is it possible, people kept accusing me of just liking this game with nostalgia, and I pointed out that I hadn't played, the Mega Mans or the Yoshis or the Metroids or anything like that. I didn't play any of those games of that era, so why am I having a nostalgia factor? And people were just being dismissive and people, let's just be honest with ourselves, about it. Which is kind of my point in a nutshell. While nostalgia is definitely something that adds to the enjoyment of this game, and I would not deny that for a second, to imply that the only reason that I and other people like me love this game is because we've got rose-tinted glasses of when we were much younger is dismissive and frankly insulting. It's literally looking at us and saying, you are too stupid to understand your own opinion. And that's not cool, if I could be blunt. I think, though, the other thing to mention here is that while nostalgia can and does taint some things, I mean, again, as I mentioned, the then and now concept, I go back to certain movies or books or games or whatever, and I like, why did I ever like this, I know I'm not alone in that. But at the same time, the reason so many of those older games were so touted, were so loved, was not because we were playing them when we were kids, or in my case, like a teenager. We liked them because they were good games. The very first then and now game I did was Mario Brothers 3, and I went into that kind of nervous because I remembered Mario 3 so fondly. I had such history with it. Would I still enjoy the game having replayed it? And the answer was yeah, I totally enjoyed it because it was a good game. You see the difference here? And I mention this specifically because a lot of indie games, and I mean a lot, are literally effectively cash grabs. Here's an 8-bit game, or here's a 16-bit game, built in order to emulate the NES era, or the SNES era, or the old PC era, point and clicks, or adventure-type games, or top-down tactical RPGs. I've seen dozens upon dozens of garbage games, especially on Steam lately, that their only selling point is, hey, it's just like, when you were a kid. And they didn't bother to make a good game and then affix that to it. This is one of the reasons why, when they make Shovel Knight 2, I'm going to buy the crap out of that for full price pre-order when it's released. Because I believe that they are not just going to make another nostalgia fest or whatever. I believe they're going to make a good game and then attach nostalgia to it. So let's go ahead and move on to something much, much more boring. Let's talk about the story. I just realized I actually missed a point, so we're not going to talk about story just yet. Sorry. Instead, we're going to talk about tutorializing. I've mentioned this before, and I'm going to be brief here, but a lot of people get sick of excessive tutorials in games. It's actually been parodied in several things. See the Far Cry Dragons, whatever thing is a good example of that. My point here is that one of the things that people tend to forget is, in my opinion, professionally and personally, good game design tutorializes in the game, in the levels, in the bosses. As I've often said, more modern World of Warcraft raids are well designed, more so than older ones were, specifically because of the fact that they will actually tutorialize some of the boss mechanics in the trash. And therefore the trash serves a purpose rather than just being a time gate like it was in older raids. Let's see, Molten Core for a good example of that. Similarly, when you have, I mean, Shovel Knight has this all over the place, but the Zeldas are pretty good about this, or to use another example that is not Shovel Knight. The idea of you go through this level or stage or whatever, and you see something act in a way. This is that whole branching, learning thing I mentioned earlier. And it's like, okay, well, I know that this is going to work this way, so when you encounter it later in another stage entirely, you're ready for it. Which brings me to my point. This definitely takes a page out of the Mega Man book, in a good way. Because one of the things people tend to forget about Mega Man's was the meat of the Mega Man games was always the Skull Castle stages. The first 8 levels, in some cases 9 levels, depending on if there's an intro thing, were always tutorials. Excuse me. Most people tend to forget this fact. The first 8 stages are, here's the different types of enemies in this game. Here's the mechanics in this game, and as you go through, you get stronger. You get better because you gain new weapons and new abilities, and you get more adept at using them. You learn how to use those abilities, and you learn how the different mechanics of the game work. The puzzles, the designs, the bosses, all of it. Then you hit Skull Castle. Skull Castle is the exam of it, to put it bluntly. How well have you done at the rest of the game? How well have you learned these aspects of the game? And this is especially true when it comes to Mega Man, because a lot of people tend to forget that in most Mega Man games, if you were to do a difficulty curve, it usually is pretty much just like this. It's almost uniformly average difficulty. In some later games, it curves up a little bit. Shovel Knight itself does this. It curves up a little bit. The later levels after the first few are definitely harder, but it's a slow, gentle slope, which is also part of that gateway thing I mentioned earlier. And then you hit this stage, or the final stages. Oh, looks like I died. You hit these final stages and you die. But the point is, the difficulty does this, and there's actually a difficulty cliff. Now, I've actually talked about difficulty cliffs before and why usually they're a bad thing. The only way in which a difficulty cliff can be properly executed is, in my opinion, in this way, in the final exam format. The classic Mega Man Skull Castle format, aka, alright, we've given you all the tools, we've given you all the time to gain the experience and learn what you're doing. Here you go, make it work. And that is the, excuse me, the last 3 levels of this place in a nutshell. This game's last 3 levels were much, much shorter than all the previous levels, but much, 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 much harder. I had far harder of a time with those levels than I did the entire rest of the game combined. But again, good thing. So, I said I'd talk about story. Let's talk about story. The absence of story in this game is interesting, because it isn't really absent. It's another thing that's one of those hallmarks of the older games, of the older eras. I mean, how much of a story do you remember of Mega Man 2? Not any of the ancillary works. Nothing that fleshed it out, nothing that came out afterwards. What was the story in Mega Man 2? I'll save you some time for those of you who haven't played it. Dr. Wily has escaped and made 8 new robots. Go stop him. That was it. However, I'm actually being disingenuous, because that's not quite true. There was more to it than that. We got tiny little tidbits in the way it played and the way we saw certain aspects of Mega Man and the characters, to get tiny little aspects of characterization there, like the fact that Mega Man is inherently a peaceful individual, to name one example. Or how about the fact that Dr. Wily is obviously a deranged individual, not just a typical madman. He actually has mental issues, etc., etc. There's tiny little tidbits there in the way they're presented, which is something I'm bringing up for this reason. Shovel Knight does all over the place. There's lots of little bits of characterization, especially in the dialogue between Shovel Knight and the various other knights, which overall kept me invested enough to really want to see what happened at the end. Now, spoiler alert in just a minute. The only thing that can consider a spoiler in this whole game. Giving you a moment. Not going to do any editing, just giving you a moment to... Okay, it's long enough. I predicted, basically from the first time I picked up the game, that the Enchantress was in fact the Shield Knight. I was then surprised to find out that I was basically wrong about that. That the Enchantress was actually this evil, magical, essence, or shadowy, dark, whatever you want to call it, regardless of Shield Knight, and just happened to have possessed Shield Knight when she put on the amulet. Nice little touch, a surprisingly subtle bit of game design or story design there, because what that does is it enables the main character, Shovel Knight himself in this case, to be invested in dealing with the situation and still have the tragedy of having lost someone, and at the same time have the possibility of redeeming themselves and reclaiming them and you know, saving the day, as opposed to just winning the day. Nice little touch there, small but crucial, I think. But the other thing I really liked about it, though, is, well, I need to change scenes for this. There's a lot of subtle little things that really help flesh this game's story and presentation out a lot. And this is a great example of that animation thing I was just talking about, by the way. We have, every night after a major level, Shovel Knight dreams of Shield Knight falling from the sky. And you have to catch her, and you can intuit that almost immediately. And you can fight these enemies and get some gold, so it has a gameplay purpose as well as a story purpose. The gameplay purpose is obvious. Here's a money bag, basically, because you can get a ton of gold on these things. The story purpose is, this is obviously Shovel Knight's own guilt, hardship, feelings, etc., of how much he feels he has failed her, and therefore struggles to catch her, which leads us to this scene when you defeat the Enchantress, first form, of course. And she reverts to, you know, the magic wears off, the Enchantress leaves her body, and Shield Knight is left over. And I love this because I admittedly didn't see this coming. This is great foreshadowing in gameplay, the fact that you then have to catch her. Yes, I know you don't actually have to catch her, but damn, I really wanted to at this point in time. Oh my god, I actually gave a damn about these characters. Speaking of which, another nice thing, Shield Knight is a pretty awesome character. She gets very little screen time, not counting her time as the Enchantress, which isn't her, therefore I don't count it. But she comes across as someone who is very competent, very stalwart, very decent person. Definitely, if I can be blunt, I don't know how to put this. She is the strength of this duo, really. Even though you play Shovel Knight, even though he is the main character, he is different. And I'll talk about why in a little bit, but she is the strength of this. She is the one who completes the team. She is the one who uplifts him. Now, she would not be nearly as strong without him. They are a duo, after all, a team. But I love this. Look at this. Look at this. She actually enables you through teamwork and through working together in a literal, factual gameplay way in order to defeat the last boss by literally enabling you to boost up in order to hit her properly. And of course, she'll do this thing here. You'll see it in a second, where she actually blocks the shots. I have seen so few games that do characterization like this in gameplay, in a boss fight like this. This was amazing stuff right here. I loved this last boss so much. Mainly because of what it did with the two main characters. And I really wish I had a better way to explain this. So I think I'm just going to talk about a little bit more about the Knight system, which is basically the last thing I have to talk about. Before I get to that, because that is my literal last thing I'm going to talk about, I want to talk a little bit more about the writing and dialogue in this game. It is a little bit on the simple side, but at the same time, it has very much that Dragon Quest effect to it. AKA, it's kind of lighthearted and serious when it needs to be, and funny the rest of the time, and it's very, very punny. Very just tongue-in-cheek, you know, making fun of everything kind of a thing. But I love that. I eat that kind of stuff up, and so that really helped elevate the thing. I got to the point where I would talk to, like, every person in town just to see what weird, stupid, silly, wacky little thing they'd say. I love that. Another little note here. I was actually going to cut away that, but I want to add something. Here's the village people, horse people, there's bird people. One thing that was really cool they did, this is another excellent game story integration thing, is you see that tower? Whoop, there we go. That tower is visible from literally the first stage. From the very first screen of the entire game, you can see that. And when you're in the village here, you can actually see the tower in the distance. And this is the ending that's playing here. Awesome characterization in the ending, too. And as I've said before, a well-done ending is something that cannot make or break, well, cannot make a game, but can break a game, and should be good in order to help add to the flavor and enjoyment of a game. I've talked about this extensively when it comes to Mass Effect 3 especially. But, and about Dragon Age Origins for that matter. But getting back to my point, the fact that you can literally see the goal from the first part of the thing not only is awesome because it literally shows you where you're going to be going and gives you that, you know, that's the end destination kind of a thing, but it also has its own story implications because it means everyone in this particular valley that you're trying to adventure through has a constant visual reminder of just how screwed they are because the source of their plight and their trouble is always visible in the distance. Nice little touch. Now we'll cut away. Last thing I want to talk about is actually really simple. It's the knights. Now, I do like that all the knights have their own little characterization and their own little personalities, and I like that they have their own little bits of dialogue, not just here, but in the successive fight later, which I'll be showing if I talk long enough, and of course, during the ending. For reference, yes, I saved them from dangling. I didn't even think about that for a millisecond. I was like, yes, come on, come on. If anything, I was actually slightly disappointed because I thought it would be really awesome if then, you know, they decided to help me out or give me something or, you know, have some kind of teamwork fight against the last boss. I was like, teamwork fight in a game like this? Yeah, right. And then the Shield Knight thing, which was awesome, happened, but I digress. The thing that I find most interesting about the Knights is they are thematic villains. They are thematic characters, I should say. This is not something that is exclusive to villains, although it happens often. This is something that's always been fascinating to me personally, and I know I am not alone in this because this is something that is repeated a lot. Lots of people in anime, in movies, and video games, mostly video games and anime, to be totally blunt, really like to get into that thematic thing. If you don't know what I mean, probably the most basic example, and indeed the thing that started my particular love affair with this concept, was Final Fantasy I and the Four Fiends of the Elements. You know, the idea of the fire guy, the water guy, the blade guy, the shield guy, or girl, it's not gender specific, you know, the band of people who, and I call it thematic because each of them have their own little theme, their own little shtick that is theirs and the kind of thing that they actually focus on, care about, etc., right? And I've always enjoyed that. Like I said, probably dating back to Final Fantasy I is the most strongest original occurrence of that. But that's always been something I've loved. I actually wrote an entire setting based entirely on that concept of everyone being themed. Elemente is the one I'm talking about, if you're curious. And the way they present these 8 guys and their variances between each other, the differences in size and presentation and talk, and the different tactics they use during the fights, which themselves also indicate their own personality types, it was all awesome. That's good. Now we're going to enter speculative territory, and this is the last thing I want to talk about, okay? I always found the idea of a knight system like this fascinating, because in my mind, this implies so much about this society, this culture, the idea of what would have happened in real life if instead of every knight, well, instead of what actually happened with knights in real life, which I'm not going to go into, but yes, I know a decent amount about it. Instead of that, what if each knight was someone who had backing? Okay, that's the distinguishing point that defines a knight. Okay, we're going to use that as our definer. So a knight is someone who has backing of some sort or another. Maybe it's financial, maybe it's political, maybe it's military, maybe it's just personal power. Maybe it's their own strengths and weaknesses, or their mind, or their cunning, you know. But they have something that backs them to make them more than just another Joe, more than just some other guy in a suit, right? So with that backing and with those talents and skills that they have, they then focus on a particular aspect of being a knight, of combat, of a mindset, if you will. The Tinker Knight, the Mole Knight, the Frost Knight, and the King Knight, and all these guys each focus very much on their own particular concept, their theme, right? And I always found that fascinating because in many ways I felt like that really is a way to fleshing out the characters without actually having a lot of screen time or a lot of dialogue, because there's so much that can be extrapolated from that. Why is it Tinker Knight is the Tinker Knight? This is obviously someone with a great number of wealth and resources at his disposal. I mean, look at this thing! And yet, he is this tiny, diminutive little individual who we see as rather clumsy, but definitely brilliant. The thing that he had, the backing he had, was his resources and his mind. And so that's why he focused on his technology, on augmenting himself with tools and abilities, and mechas, for God's sakes, and missile launchers and giant spiral things, right? Because then he could actually accomplish something, because that was his mindset, his perspective. I don't know if I'm explaining this right, but I feel like this is the most interesting way to flesh out a character, is by just not deliberately doing it, but leaving it up to player interpretation, like it is done here. And all of this is freely interpretation. This is definitely me reading too much into things, I will admit that freely. And yet, I feel like at least some of that was done deliberately. The game wanted us to interpret these. And I love the concept because it speaks volumes not just about the main 8 guys, but about the main 2 characters. Arguably 3. We have Shield Knight. We'll talk about her first. I have always found the concept of using shields as an offensive weapon fascinating and interesting and engaging, especially since I myself have actually done work with shields and swordplay in real life, sword and board being one of my favorite styles of combat. Obviously, that's just, for play. I've never actually tried to fight someone to kill or whatever like that because I live in the modern age. But the point being, it's a fascinating function. It's a fascinating form for me. And so I find the idea of shields as a weapon so interesting that I actually, once upon a time, and by once upon a time I mean semi-recently, in the Imperium there are actually 2 major characters throughout the whole of the Imperium who exclusively utilize shields as their weapons. They don't use anything else. They just use shields. To great effect, I might add, because a shield is actually a very good weapon, and there's a reason sword and board can be so effective. I mention this, though, because this also ties into what I was talking about with her being the meat of the party, the strength of the party. Because to do that kind of thing is going to be very, very difficult. To exclusively use shields is not as easy as it sounds, and to exclusively be able to use your weapon both offensively and defensively requires you to basically be the carry, if I could use it under such terms, unless I'm inverting that. By the way, this was awesome. They're all just at a banquet. They had to have the Mega Man rematch thing. They decided to have them all just having a banquet. That's cool. And if you notice, you don't kill any of them. They don't explode, so it actually kind of makes more sense in a story purpose than it did back in Mega Man. Yes, I know it is explained in Mega Man. I explained it in Robot War, but the point remaining. Getting back to my point. So Shield Knight is interesting, especially because her contrast to Shovel Knight is fascinating. Let's go and just dig into this. I find Shovel Knight to be an incredibly interesting character. He is not the Mario. He is someone who obviously has a sense of right and wrong and good and justice, and yet at the same time he is a very mercenary individual. He is an adventurer. And what adventurers want is money, fame, and in many cases power. And yet, I don't think power in his case is applicable. I just mentioned that for the sake of completion. But Shovel Knight in particular, despite being effectively an adventurer, a mercenary, is still overall someone I would call a good person, probably chaotic good if I had to put a label on it. And he's also, despite having tremendous backing, skill, time, training, resources, obviously because he does all the things he does in this game, but also the things that are implied he did before this. I mean, we see a screen before the game even begins about the incredible amount of wealth that he and Shield Knight have both managed in their career. He has tons of backing, just like all of these knights do. And yet he uses a shovel. That's the thing that really gets me. That's the thing that really I find fascinating about him as a character. As I mentioned, all of their different themes really speak to them. Their weapons and their motifs as well speak to their characters, but none more so than Shovel Knight. He uses a simple worker's tool as his method of existing, his method of functioning, his theme, his strong suit. And I've always gotten this impression from him that he is very much an O'Brien type character. A very down-to-earth, simple kind of guy, not particularly, not some great, amazing hero or whatever, not someone who is going to soar through the ages as a legend, not someone who is incredibly good at all turns like Mario, not someone who is winning against all odds despite the thing, and he's the courageous in the face of darkness like Jim's Raider or anything like that. He's just a guy. He's a very relatable, very human, very down-to-earth guy. Again, what I usually refer to as the O'Brien type of character. And I like that about him. And it kind of and that was a theory I had before I even really got into the game. That was something I just kind of came up with because of the whole thing. And then I started playing the game and reading his dialogue and seeing the way he interacts in certain scenes. And it kind of fleshed out even more for me because I get this impression that the Black Knight, or Dark Knight, or whatever he calls himself, who also uses a shovel, I might add, is much more the I'm trying to be the hero, or in this case, the anti-hero, to be more specific, as opposed to Shovel Knight, who's just trying to live, just trying to enjoy his existence and get by from day to day. Again, much more human, down-to-earth perspective than basically all the rest. I also find that interesting because I feel like that explains most strongly why he does not take the option, when it is offered, multiple times I might add, to join this order that the Enchantress has gone. Because the order is... It's funny because I don't feel like most of these characters are particularly evil. A few of them certainly lean towards evil, Treasure Knight being a big one, and Plague Knight being another one. But at the same time, I'm not really sure that I can quantify any of them as actively really bad guys, as opposed to simply people with their own desires, their own means, their own interests, and their own themes. The one thing that they were offered by the Enchantress that they all went for was the opportunity to have more power, more territory, more land. They could actually rule over this valley at her behest as a result of their joining this order. And again, I feel like Shovel Knight would probably have been offered this invitation just like the Black Knight was, and well, I should say the Shovel Knight was offered this invitation just like Black Knight was, but both of them disagreed with it for completely different reasons. The Black Knight because he was on his crusade to save his, the woman he cares about. Shovel Knight because why would he need that? Why would O'Brien be tempted by thoughts of power and prestige and being able to rule over the land? No, of course not. And it's interesting because it also kind of made the ending a little bit sweeter for me, seeing all of these characters, with a couple of notable exceptions, having some form of satisfying ending. The only two exceptions really being Pridemore, Kingly Knight, or King Knight, whatever her name is, and Treasure Knight. But all the rest had some kind of reconciliation with the lands and the people they were living on and around. And I liked that. Shovel Knight is, in my opinion, a phenomenally amazing game. It's got through-the-roof incredible gameplay. It has love pouring from every seeping inch of it. And it's even got aspects of story and characterization in what is effectively a Mega Man game. Don't have much more to add. I hope you guys have enjoyed. And I'm not doing this new format anymore. This has taken so long. I wanted to do something special for this, and I've been planning this for a while. We're going to go back to Talking Head next video. See you around, guys.